Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. My guest is Norman Siegel, the attorney known for his defense of civil rights and civil liberties and the former director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. I'm going to start soft, all right? I was just talking recently to a mutual friend, and we were talking about your readings at Strawberry Fields of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and all the amendments. And then I watched one of the older ones with the ladies, the grannies, I think. That was so lovely. You teach, and you have other people reading it. And you've done it every year for how long?
Well, this year will be the 50th year. Now, we've done it with the grannies in the last 12 years, first in Central Park and Strawberry Fields. But a few years ago, because of the need to talk about gender equality, we moved it to Riverside so we could be next to Eleanor Roosevelt. And this July 4th, people are welcomed. It will be the 50th year that I've been doing it. I started in 1969 in Atlanta. I tell one little funny story. My wife, Sarah Lee Evans, and I were in Barcelona one year, like 2001 or whatever, 2000, whatever it was, and I had forgot to bring the Constitution with me. So on one day, we walked all around to the bookstores. No one had the Constitution. One bookstore had it in Spanish. There was a crisis. What are we going to do? So I called my friend Johnny Weiss, told him there's a crisis, and overnight he faxed to the hotel where we were staying the Constitution. So it continued.
You don't know it by heart?
You know, each year when I read it before we go to do the production, I learned something new. Yeah. A couple of years ago,
isn't that amazing?
I found the Emoluments Clause. So pertinent today. Yeah. So yes, every year I find something new.
So why aren't we following it more now? Does it call for an impeachment?
No, I think it does call for an impeachment. And I also think that Elizabeth Drew wrote a op-ed the other day. I thought it was terrific that if the Democrats don't at least proceed with an impeachment investigation, they'll be remembered as the people, to use a good Brooklyn term, who chickened out. And to elevate that, they have a constitutional obligation.
They have a responsibility.
Absolutely.
I agree with you.
And when people say to me, do you think the Senate would ever vote him to be removed? My answer is no. But for historical purposes, for my grandkids, they have to have a historical record of what happened in the last 2 years, the violations of the Constitution, the abuse of power, the violation of the rule of law, and that's what an impeachment would do. And the public needs to hear the evidence.
And if it was an impeachment, the people they want to hear from would have to appear? Would there be a difference?
Well, if they have a proceeding and people didn't show up, Congress could subpoena them. Someone could object to a subpoena, as we're now learning about subpoenas.
The same procedure.
But if you go to court, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, history, in my opinion, demonstrates that the independence of the federal judiciary, whether it was in my experience in the Deep South in the 60s and the 70s, or even in the last 2 years, where I'll explain and give evidence to that, the federal judges who are appointed for life, Democrats and very often Republicans as well, they understand what their role is in the constitutional democracy. They're the safety valve. When the executive branch, is what's happening now, and when the legislative branch, in some instances happening now too, abdicate their responsibility, it's that third branch, the judiciary, is our safety valve to preserve the principles and values in our Constitution.
But what happens if it gets appealed to the Supreme Court?
Well, that is a concern now.
And how often do they get appealed to the Supreme Court?
Well, recently we see that on the question of the census question, that the 3 federal judges all said that what the Secretary did was not appropriate, and they put in an injunction. But based on the hearing that occurred a couple of weeks ago, it does appear that the 5 conservatives will probably win 5-4 to then overturn that. The previous Supreme Court decision on travel ban 3, when you had the Ninth Circuit and district courts saying that Trump didn't have the authority, the constitutional authority to do what he was due by travel ban 3, the Supreme Court reversed. So we're now seeing where Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, or his appointees, added to Roberts and to Alito and Thomas, that's a solid 5. I'm also concerned, God forbid, constitutionally forbid, that if Trump ever won again, you have Ginsburg and Breyer. It could turn out that he gets a 7-2. It would be interesting if he keeps appointing men. It would be 7 men versus 2 women, Kagan and Sotomayor. Terrible visual in and of itself. There's a growing concern more and more now, we've always had it historically, that the Supreme Court is a political instrument. And I've always been opposed to that. I don't like the idea of packing the court. I say to people, do you remember what happened when FDR tried to do that? Some people say, who's FDR? I said, he was from New York. You should know who he was. He also was our president for many years. So you're concerned about some of the advocacy about how to deal with the present situation. And my simple answer is, the Constitution, we should try it sometime. If we try it and adhere to the principles and values and see it as a roadmap, a guide to how we deal with the present problems, I think we'll do much better.
So you have, I didn't know when to start to talk about Declaration 17, but since we're talking about the different courts.
Yeah, I love what we did on that. As soon as Trump got elected, a handful of people that I knew got together, and we were concerned based on what we knew about his record and personality in New York. But we made a determination that personality and character should not be the focus. It's policy, it's practices. And from the very first day, he gets to the White House, he removes from the website in the White House all references to civil rights, LGBT rights, climate control. And in the context of all of that, also he removes all Spanish content from the website. So you look at the constituencies he's attacking. And so I looked over and over again about the Declaration in 1776. Wow, he's King George. So I began to draft, following as much as possible the wording of the 1776. But when it said all men are created equal, we changed it to all people are created equal. And we wrote Declaration 17. At first it was 2017, and the guru said on the media, it's too long. You got to condense it. So it became Declaration17.com, and we then had people review it and edit it, and we put it out. We now have signers in 40 states around the country, and we've updated it in the last 2 years with about 60 major federal court decisions. And the reason I want to do that, again, is I get older, I believe in the history aspect, that 20, 30 years from now, my grandkids, their kids, they're going to look at this period, and there needs to be a record of what happened. And of the 60 cases that we've monitored over the last 2 years and 2 months,
these are all cases against something he's done.
It's his policies, his practices. If it's a state court in Kansas who throws out the new law about abortion right, we don't do that because that wasn't Trump policies or practices. And of the 60 cases that we've monitored, we don't monitor every single one because it's all volunteer effort. And of the 60, there were about 82 decisions and orders. If we used his terms, winners and losers, he's a loser in 90% of those cases. What I say is the Trump administration and the president did not prevail or substantially prevail in 90% of those 82 decisions. And it's a commentary, once again, on the federal court. And even on questions, there was a Seventh Circuit decision in Chicago about sanctuary cities, where Trump is trying to get First Sessions and now Barr to take the funding away from the cities that proclaim their sanctuary cities. We, New York, we have the Statue of Liberty. We've been proud to be a sanctuary city, and a lot of cities are. And so they try to take the money away, and that's unconstitutional. It's a violation of the 10th Amendment. and he doesn't have the authority to do that. And court after court strikes that down. And the Seventh Circuit, where there were Republican judges on that one, said very clearly and eloquently, I mean, it really moves me. I want people to read this stuff, to have faith again in the system. They say that's our role, to hold him accountable and to make sure that the executive branch of government doesn't violate the rule of law. So for someone like me, I love being a civil rights lawyer, and when you see that within the established entities, especially the federal courts, it's what it's supposed to be about. When I was in the South, and I was a civil rights lawyer with the ACLU in the late 60s and 70s, we'd go to the federal courts. We'd go to people like Frank Johnson in Montgomery, Alabama. We'd go to the Fifth Circuit, Elbert Tuttle. These were Republican appointees by Herbert Brownell, the Attorney General, and Dwight Eisenhower. And they were consistent. We were able to break down segregation in the Deep South, I believe, because of the federal courts and the Fifth Circuit, and a lot of them were Republican appointees. So for me, when you go to federal court, what you're looking for is a judge, A, who's smart, and most of them are all smart, but someone who has an open mind. And what I've learned, whether it's William Brennan, whether it's Blackmun, who wrote the Roe versus Wade, Republican appointee, that when you're there for life and you're sitting there and you begin to see things in a different way, you can evolve. But so far, give you an example, recently with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh on the issue with regard to the census question, which the federal courts, 3 federal courts said it's not appropriate to ask that question. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Republican conservative appointees referred to international law to talk about the UN.
You said, but
and when
in the past
when Breyer did it on death penalty, they all said, no, this is America. We only look at what our laws are.
Right.
And then you find out, I saw in the Times the other day, that it was the Trump administration's brief that made that point.
International law.
So then the question becomes, were those 2 guys puppets? Were they paying back the person who appointed them? And all of a sudden I start to get worried about the future of even something like the Supreme Court, as well as his appointees in the federal system.
And now we see his Attorney General, who isn't helping us either. But do you think Roberts...
He's the hope. Even on, I've been telling people on the census case, given the argument, it looks like, and most of the people who are commenting on it said, our side's going to lose 5-4. My only hope, and it's a slim hope, is that Roberts understands the need for the Supreme Court's credibility, that if they lose the credibility, and they're seen as a political instrument of the executive branch of government, that's not good for the country, and it's not good for his legacy as well.
Right. He wasn't appointed by Trump, right?
No. But so he could potentially become a swing, but after I say that, I bite my tongue because I don't think it's going to happen. And we just have to face up. And what we then have to do, and I'm starting to do it now, go to the state courts. Go to the state courts, because in the federalism, you can go, for example, to the New York courts and argue the New York State Constitution. The federal Constitution is the floor, the minimum you're required to. But take free speech. Free speech or Fourth Amendment about what the restrictions are on law enforcement. Our Court of Appeals, recognizing our social mores and our traditions, have gone further, and the state constitution can become the ceiling. So between the floor and the ceiling, there's a lot of room, and therefore creative lawyers can do that. When William Brennan retired, he was making that advocacy to some of us that go to your state constitutions, because you can find even greater protection for the people in the state constitutions.
In the cases that you cite, are any of the judges appointed by Trump?
Yes, yes.
And they're following the same pattern?
So far, there's one in D.C. That followed that pattern. If I remember correctly, the CNN Jim Acosta, with regard to that case, I believe that judge in D.C. was a Trump Republican appointee, and he did the right thing. So it fits my premise and my experience of 50 years of being a lawyer, that even Republicans, when they get that life appointment, as opposed to having to run, and you know what it means to get reelected, if you don't have to worry about running for the office again and you're there for life, except for high crimes and misdemeanors, you can become independent and you can evolve.
So why is the Congress not assuming its responsibility? They're putting this political thing. They're looking to the impeachment of Clinton, right?
Yes.
They're saying that they had such a what do you call it? Not a victory following that impeachment. They lost a lot of seats. But this is a different question.
Well, it's a very clearly different question. And what's troubling is, and you touched upon it, they're looking at it through the prism of politics.
Yeah.
How is it going to affect 2020?
Yeah.
And the argument is that his base will get more emboldened and come out more.
It's such nonsense.
Put that aside. When Madison and Hamilton were drafting the Federalist Papers, they specifically talked about that the provisions regarding impeachment were a check and balance on the executive branch. You weren't supposed to look at it through whether or not you'll win the next presidential election.
Right.
What's sad is that it's close. It's only, 16, 18 months away from the next election, and everybody's focused in on making sure, I shouldn't say everyone, the people on my side, everyone is focused on what do we do and how do we do to make sure that Trump doesn't get reelected. The problem with that is then you get blinded by what the right thing to do and what the principled thing to do. The principled thing here is to begin an impeachment proceeding.
That was my motto throughout my political, when in doubt,
do the right thing.
Resort to principle, always. I mean, how can you be faulted if you resort to principle? You can't. It's something that, it's a responsibility you have. It just drives me crazy.
Right, but a lot of the people who get elected, my experience, their focus is on being reelected.
Reelected, right.
We're moving up the ladder.
Hasn't that changed in the last, was that the way it was in the old days?
I think it's, I hate to use the term, it's the nature of the beast who wants it. You were an aberration. You were smart, you did your homework, you got punished by the city council speaker numerous times, but that only enhanced your status.
Right.
And I can't explain it to people because what they're concerned about, whether it's the city or the state or even the federal level, they're concerned about whether they'll get reelected. And my answer to that is, especially in places like New York, but even in America today, you do the principled thing and you get known to do the principled thing, you'll get more votes.
Right. Well, and sometimes you'll get defeated, but at least you have a principle, right?
You can go home
anyway,
and go to sleep at night with a clear conscience.
So what can we do about that?
You can't give up. I learned when I was in the South in the civil rights movement that people told me that we have no other option. We have to continue to be peaceful, to use the system to try to change the system because A, we're apostles of nonviolence. So violence doesn't work. You know, what's happened in Venezuela, it should never get to that. So we're not going to have that in America. And so what you have to do is roll up your sleeves and try to persuade people, talk to them, to listen to people. For example, I've been trying to talk more and more. I'm a white guy, grew up in Brooklyn from a working class family. I need between now and 2020 to talk to white guys who in fact voted for Trump and explain to them that he's really not for you, he hasn't delivered for you, and in fact, there's someone else that you should consider.
Can you convince them?
Not all of them, because there's a certain appeal to Trump in the sense that he's an outsider, he's taking on the system, the establishment. There's a lot of anger out there with regard to white guys, and more stuff is happening where white guys feel that they're being ignored, neglected. I need to talk to them about there's a legitimacy that certain groups now, especially in the women's movement, it's about time that women began to stand up and confront you with regard to your practices and your views.
Do they listen to his speeches?
Some do, some do.
And they don't get
well, they
taken aback? This is the President of the United States?
It's cruel, or he uses the word when he describes the FBI the other day in Green Bay as scum. And you would think that people immediately, especially when he's attacking the law enforcement, but they've created it such a way that it was the dark state, the deep state, and there's something negative about what happened in 2016 from the FBI, because they get one guy writing an email that he shouldn't have written in his capacity as an FBI person. So in the context of the answer to your question, there's no option other than to continue to try to talk and try to persuade people, and then finally find a candidate who goes to Wisconsin, who goes to Michigan, who doesn't take anything for granted and works as hard as she or he can to try to bring this out. And I'm relatively optimistic. I think politically, the states that Hillary Clinton won, the Democrats can win again. And so you got to get Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and maybe even Florida now, because a lot of the people who were felons, disproportionate African American men, can vote.
But look at what they just did. They passed a law in Florida and you have to pay.
Well, someone should go in and challenge that. And then again in the courts, money should not be the criteria. Same thing, Trump now is claiming that people who come in for asylum, who come over the border, have to pay. And that there'll be lawsuits on that as well. And what's also happening in the last 2 years is more and more people are actually fighting back. More and more people are getting civil rights lawyers to go to court to challenge the Trump policies and practices. And I think that's a healthy sign as well.
When you said about Trump's early actions when he went into the White House, he didn't know about that he could do those kinds of things. Who were the people underneath?
Telling him he can do that?
Who were the people underneath that we don't know?
Well, for example, on immigration, which he, in my opinion, is horrible. You know, again, we have the Statue of Liberty.
Got that guy in the
Stephen Miller, and so you have people like that. You had Bannon, and
I'm convinced there are more there. But
well, I'm sure there are more people who are saying really that you can do that. But yes, on the first few days when he went in and took that off the website, that told us we were in for a rocky, troubled period.
Are you also reading constitutions around?
Yeah, I went last year to about a half a dozen colleges and went to Cornell, Harvard, Duke, CUNY, since I'm a graduate of CUNY, and talked to young people. People should go and look at Declaration17.com. If you agree with what we said there, put your name for historical purposes that you oppose the policies and practices. Now, that's a whole nother issue about his character. And making false statements, all that kind of stuff. But we focus just on the policies and practices. And I do think in the long run, if people will learn the principles and values that are in the Constitution and the amendments, that's the roadmap to deal with not only the current controversies, but future ones. And finally, what I say to people, America has had dark days before, and yet we've prevailed. And I think we'll prevail again here. Maybe I'm wrong, but I go back when I learned when I was a young person in the South. We have no other option. There is no other option.
You organized for the impeachment in this, right?
I always say Richard Nixon did one good thing. He brought my wife, Sarah Lee Evans, and I together.
I saw that you both worked for the ACLU at that time organizing, right?
Right. So if I have an expertise, impeachment is one of them, and I'm happy that my congressperson, I think yours too, Jerry Nadler, has been doing a very good job. I hope he doesn't get slowed down by Nancy Pelosi and some of the other people. I saw Hakeem Jeffries this morning sort of taking the Pelosi role, disappointed on that. Well, he actually was saying, you know, let's slow down on impeachment. We have to do infrastructure, et cetera. We have to help the American people. Helping the American people now is to begin that impeachment
and not everybody participates in the impeachment procedures, so they can continue with their infrastructure.
They can do both.
I mean, yeah, there's no point that you can't do both. It's just, they will, I think, I agree with you, go down in history as a Congress that did not, they're allowing the Congress to lose its power. I mean, they're just.
Well, I think that's right, but what also is happening the last few days is Trump saying that he's not going to abide by any of the subpoenas. He's not going to let people. That in and of itself could be a ground for impeachment.
Seems so.
And the Congress has to look in the mirror and say, do I count?
Certainly obstruction, right?
Absolutely. And you have a constitutional obligation to at least make the inquiry. If you don't do the inquiry, or you don't go down this road because you think the Senate won't remove him, I think that's history is going to say that was the wrong decision.
And not only that, but their hearings are in fact the inquiry. So why do they resist it anyway?
I think they resist it now because they're being told by the leadership that if we do this, we ruin the chances of winning the election. And my answer is you can do both. Yeah. And in fact, if you do this, I think you'll enhance, because what we'll do is show, especially, look, 8 million people supposedly who voted for Obama switched to Trump. We don't need all 8 million back. If we can get a significant percentage of 8 million people back to vote against Trump, we're okay.
I think we've already gotten it, but they should write to Pelosi. We should write to Pelosi, right?
And tell her.
It's such a joy to have you.
No, it's
and to
a pleasure.
hear about all these things. I hope you'll come back and we'll keep watching.